The 2025 webinar series, Saving the Sacred, is the result of public input during our state planning process. Today's session, Cemetery Preservation Planning, is the first of a three-part series focusing on cemetery preservation. Our speaker today is Jason Harpe. Jason is a public historian and the Director of Cemetery Conservation with Richard Grubb and Associates. He has over 25 years of experience in the field of historic preservation in both public and private sectors. He leads workshops on cemetery preservation for historical societies, student groups, museums, churches, and historic preservation organizations, in addition to conserving gravestones and monuments of diverse types in family, church, and municipal cemeteries. He is a certified gravestone and monument conservator and a professional associate with the American Institute for Conservation. So thank you for being here, and I will turn things over to you, Jason.
Sounds great. Do you have the, oh, there we go. The presentation. Oh, there we go. All right, it's my pleasure to be here with everyone today. I am always excited to talk about cemetery preservation planning to groups of all sizes, whether that be 2 people or 100 plus people. Over the course of about 5 to 6 years, our company has been fortunate enough to write preservation plans for cemeteries, smaller cemeteries, family cemeteries, community cemeteries, church cemeteries, as well as municipal cemeteries. And so we have pulled together through that combined experience, those combined experiences with these various types of cemeteries, a presentation that we hope can give you some tools in your toolbox to help you with your situation. I can assure you that I will not be able to, I'll show you in just a minute some of my disclaimers, that there's no way I can cover everything within 1 hour period. But we try to do the best we can within that time frame to cover as much as possible. As Lynda said, I'm the Director of Cemetery Conservation for Richard Grubb and Associates. Our main office is in Cranberry, New Jersey, and we have additional offices in Philadelphia, Wake Forest, North Carolina, and Nashville, Tennessee. My disclaimers, I don't know if anyone's ever seen my presentations, but I always have some disclaimers in the very beginning of my presentation. As I said, I will not be able to cover everything. So please contact me by email, by phone, if you do have specific questions that are not addressed in my presentation or are not addressed in the Q&A session as well. Throughout my presentation, I will be using the word grave marker as one word instead of 2 words. This comes from this usage in Ruth Little's book, Sticks and Stones, 3 Centuries of North Carolina Grave Markers, and I wanted to let you know this. So you do know that I know how to spell. For consistency, I'm only going to be using the word cemetery. I won't be breaking out what, graveyard, burial ground. Just going to call them all cemetery to be consistent throughout the presentation. I do have, I'm a big believer in case studies, and I do have only one case study that I'm going to show, but I think you'll see that this case study in this Friends organization for this African-American cemetery in Durham, North Carolina, provides a really good roadmap. And I use Gear and the Friends of Gear a lot because not only because our company has been involved, but also they have really been very intentional with all of the steps in their project. And even though they think they have a long way to go, they've actually come a long way. One thing I want you to remember, and you'll see in my presentation, is cemetery preservation and planning does not just involve cleaning grave markers. There's so much more that's involved that I'm going to point out in my presentation as well. Geophysics, the acronym GPR, or ground penetrating radar, is, I don't know if I'd say is a buzzword, but a lot of people have heard of ground penetrating radar in other geophysics or like LIDAR and magnetometry. And I'll only touch on this as it relates to a project that we did and a way to document what is in your cemetery. I will not be able to address if you have a cemetery that has, say, mausoleums, say caretakers' homes, summer houses, things like that, or either infrastructure issues. I will not be able to address those things today. In my photographs throughout the presentation, I try to give courtesy to folks who provided those photographs to me after I inquired about them, or just in the course of sharing those things with me. And again, if I don't have time to take your questions, please share your questions with me. In addition to, after my presentation, if you want to share some issues that you're facing, or any number of types of things that I may be able to use in a future presentation to be helpful to an individual or a group, please do so. I did include more text in this presentation than I usually do, and that's because if the presentation is going to be available for folks to see after the presentation, I'd much rather have text in there for some context versus having a presentation that's just photographs. And if you watch it later, you may not understand really what's going on. And as I mentioned, I'm only going to feature one case study. So what are we going to do today? We're going to talk about cemetery preservation, of course. I can't emphasize enough how important it is to have a plan, a roadmap that's going to guide you in your efforts in the future. I'm going to stress the importance, as part of the planning, also research, documentation, various types of surveys, and maintenance. Maintenance is one of the main areas or topics that we hear from a lot of cemetery stewards, and we, over the course of our experience and time working with a number of cemetery stewards, municipal crews, but again, all of these things that they can happen simultaneously, and I say it never ends. There's always something else for you to do. I want you to understand the basics of, and as Lynda said, there are 2 other sessions. This is just the first session. So in certain areas like documentation, I'm just going to talk about a little bit, because the next presentation on documentation, I want to have enough in that presentation. So a lot of these areas I'll only be touching on a little bit, because I don't want to take too much away from those future presentations, and hopefully you'll be able to have time to tune into those as well. I always say there's no one and done. We've worked with a number of cemetery stewards who think that once they do a number of tasks that they're done. There's always more to do. If you clean a grave marker, you're going to have to clean it again eventually if you want to have this pristine look in your cemetery. Jokingly, you always have to try to find younger people to help with your efforts, because a lot of cemetery stewards are older and they're looking for younger people to help who are maybe in better physical condition and maybe have a little more energy. And I say administrations change. In my experience, in my professional experience working in a quasi-judicial realm, there are a number of local governments that I've worked with who were very excited and willing to put forth the effort and financial support to help with certain cemetery efforts. And then when that administration changes, that support may end up going away or lessened. So what is cemetery preservation? I like to use these points from Prince George's County, Maryland, their cemetery preservation manual. Preservation is the retention of historic features within the cemetery through conservation, restoration, or maintenance and repair, or restoration, which be using those words in kind of interchangeably too. By preserving the cemetery, the community groups, individuals, municipalities, friends organizations are really taking steps to protect the cemeteries. Key features, forms, features, and details. Preservation can include things like cleaning up the site if there's a lot of trash, if there are downed trees and limbs, fencing, whether it's fencing around the perimeter of the cemetery, or if you have individual family plots that have either fallen into disrepair, they've been vandalized, or they've been knocked over or destroyed by downed trees or downed limbs. Maintaining your landscape, cleaning your grave markers, of course, and also resetting and repairing gravestones that may, even if they're leaning a little bit, some may be leaning just a little bit and others may be sort of leaning more in a precarious position, stretched out into the row where you have landscaping crews mowing. Additionally, the initial phases of cemetery preservation include documentation, research, and planning, and are essential steps that can be carried out by a number of different individuals and groups. And through these efforts, the cemetery can be stabilized and restored as a contributing element in your county or your city's cultural landscape. And in a lot of in some cases, let's say within African American communities or underrepresented communities, the cemeteries, typically it's the cemetery, schools, and churches that are the last remaining part of their cultural heritage and cultural landscape. So what's the difference? As I said, I may be using the words interchangeably, but these are some definitions that we have pulled from a number of different sources that we like to use. We put in our reports to explain the usage of them. So for preservation and conservation, we're basically talking about preserving existing materials with minimal intervention from either individuals interested, well-intentioned individuals or conservators. Actually restoring grave markers and monuments is returning it to a previous appearance using compatible materials. So if you're working on, say, soft material, whether it's, say, a soapstone or, say, a limestone or a marble, you want to be using something that's compatible and it's not as hard and it's works well with that material. Stabilizing is preventing further deterioration or collapse, and reconstruction is rebuilding missing materials or features using materials based on historical evidence. And I think I have a few slides in my presentation of that. Again, I'm not going to go into each one of these. I'm just going to touch on them. In addition to maintenance, another area or another bullet point or heading that we receive lots of questions about is ownership and access. I don't even have any idea how many cemeteries there are that have ownership issues. And I cannot be your legal counsel. I am not an attorney. What I will tell you is that if this is something that you are having an issue with, please reach out to me. And I do know a few attorneys who have experience with these. I'm not sure if they may be licensed in the state that you live in, but they can at least provide some guidance as to maybe some essential steps for you to try to resolve the issue. Access as well, it varies from state to state. In North Carolina, I'm sure it's different than, say, in Oklahoma, or maybe in terms of how to gain access to an ancestral cemetery when it's on private property. Forming a team is very important. If you don't already have a team, or you're thinking about it, or if you do, you're thinking about building on that team, I encourage you to put together a diverse team that has folks from a lot of different disciplines, backgrounds, say descendant communities, historic preservation professionals, landscape architects, taphophiles, folks who are basically, it's avocational. They love cemeteries. They spend a lot of time in them. Master gardeners. As a master gardener, I will tell you that they're really an important group to have in your cemetery, especially if you have a cemetery that has some original plantings or flowers or wildflowers that you are thinking about investing more time and energy in as part of the story of your cemetery. And I think I have some slides that address this as well. Historians, local government officials, bankers are important, attorneys, marketing professionals, and folks that live in close proximity to the cemetery who may know the cemetery is there and might be willing to help out in your efforts, but just don't know what they need to do. Deborah Taylor Gonzalez with Gear Cemetery, Friends of Gear Cemetery, has told me numerous times when I've asked her if they've ever had any internal issues. She said that they haven't, because they have such a strong mission statement. And I can't emphasize that enough, that a strong mission statement is so unbelievably important to help guide your efforts and your organization's efforts in the future. I actually spoke to a member of a cemetery organization just yesterday who told me that their board count has dropped from 25 to 10, and I asked him why, and he said no one wants to serve on boards anymore. So I'm hoping, if that's the case, hopefully you can get those numbers back up if that's something that's within your mission statement, to have that that exact number of members. It's necessary to research, understand previous projects. I'll refer to Friends of Gear Cemetery as well. There have been a number of iterations over the years of efforts at this cemetery to care for it. And through those iterations, you had one person who was sort of the spark plug who rallied the troops to do these things. And then that person, say, passes away, and so there's less effort, and then there's another person. So it's important to understand and research, and even if you have a person who's been leading an effort for a long time, who decides that they sort of need to retire, try to keep them around for some institutional knowledge. I'm going to show you some slides. I always like to show slides that show you should expect the unexpected in your cemetery and in your efforts. And also networking. Networking is so unbelievably important. You'll see in my presentation that there are photographs from a lot of different states with different groups. We keep in contact all the time. I like to hear what's going on, especially the cemetery stewards for which we've written preservation plans. I keep in touch with them regularly to see if they've been able to receive funding to help carry out some of the recommendations that we provided in our plans. And keep your eyes open when you're out there. I know you may think that you know the cemetery like the back of your hand, but it may surprise you what you each time you're out there, what interesting and unique things you may see that you didn't because you weren't paying enough or as close attention as you could have. So I joke about this, and you'll see why in a few slides. My edict has always been plan, plan, plan. You've got to plan. It's so very important to plan. Well, recently, now what I would consider a good friend, Sam, who was Samantha Dorm, said, that's great, but you got to have action, action, action. So I think it's so important now that I keep that in mind as I'm pushing having a plan, having a plan, having a plan. And here's, this is at the Association for Gravestone Studies Conference in York, Pennsylvania. Dr. Steve Berg from Shippensburg University, Bertha Jackman with an organization called Pennsylvania Hallowed Grounds, and Samantha Dorn with the Friends of Lebanon Cemetery. So as part of your research and documentation, I've heard people say before, we've researched it all. We know everything there is to know. And in some cases, I disagree. Maybe you have, but there's always other places or other resources that we've heard from other people, and then we've been able to find. So I'm just going to go over a few of these. And again, remember that my next presentation will actually be on research and documentation. So I will be going further in depth in these areas. State survey site forms, depending on what state you're in, you may have as part of, say, a countywide architectural survey, cemeteries that were surveyed as part of that countywide architectural survey. But also you may, like in North Carolina, we actually have, and you'll see slides of these, North Carolina cemetery survey forms. And these survey forms there is a version for, say, the general public, and then there's another version, say, for preservation professionals and archaeologists as well. You might find some stuff, as I said, with the Office of State Archaeology, environmental review reports as part of historic structure survey reports, Works Progress Administration cemetery surveys that were conducted from 1935 to 1942 are really, really helpful. They've been helpful to me in terms of, when we've been looking at, okay, what do we have now? What was there in 1936? What's missing? Those types of things. And now we're so fortunate to have so many resources available online that we didn't have years ago. Newspapers, through newspapers.com, Ancestry, Family Search, where you can find obituaries and death certificates. In a number of African American cemeteries where we've worked, the Friends organization or the families, the descendant communities, they may have identified over like 1,500 people buried in the cemetery, but there's only 300 grave markers. And so, they were able to do that through these online resources where you can find obituaries and death certificates. Topographical maps and Sanborn maps. If you have never heard of these Sanborn maps before, they're Sanborn fire insurance maps, which are very detailed, and they can be extremely helpful. And the same thing for topographical maps. As part of, say, survey work that we do, when we're looking at a specific area, we consult topo maps as well. Another great resource to look for if you have a really great archives or, say, museum with an archives who's been able to digitize their photograph collections. Again, these are really helpful. You may get lucky and find out that there's a treasure trove of photographs. Funeral home records. I have not been fortunate enough to work on a project where we've been able to find a funeral home who has retained their records. But I will say one of my professors in grad school, who is a good friend of mine, is working on a project now about a fire from 1940. And fortunately, the funeral home where the individuals who died during this fire, the funeral home has those death certificates. So it's an invaluable resource. And obviously, I'm not going to show a slide of funeral home records, but it's another good resource to check. And if you're fortunate, if you've had a few families or one family that has a funeral home, maybe they've retained their records, and you might be able to get access to them. Deeds, other city and county records, postcards. I'm going to show a few of these in here. They've been helpful to us writing National Register nominations. A lot of times you can find them on eBay, and they're not that expensive. And also primary sources like letters and journals. I think I have at least one slide in here that shows that as well. So these are some of the resources you can use for research and documentation on your cemetery. And if you've used some that I don't have on the list, please share with me, because I'm interested in knowing that as well. These are examples of those cemetery survey forms. This is one cemetery survey form that we use in North Carolina, as well as the North Carolina Historic Structure short data sheet for a cemetery. I think this was from the 1980s. So, and this is the kind of stuff we nerd out to. It's really fun. It's exciting. The grave marker on the left is for a man named Jacob Aker, who died in 1842. I happened to be doing conservation work in the cemetery about, 17, 18 years ago, and noticed these cast iron straps that I could tell had been on there quite a while. And I remember talking to what I would consider the best genealogist in the area that I live. She asked me where I was working, and I mentioned this to her. And she said, "Oh, well, this is before in North Carolina our estate files were digitized and available through Family Search." She said, "I've got a file on him at home." And so she sent me an email and said that she had a receipt, and there was a receipt in the estate file that was dated just under a year later and was signed by a German stonecutter who was from our area to basically to make the grave marker. And then there was a receipt from I think just under 2 years later from a person who was being paid for mending the headstone for the deceased Jacob Aker's grave. So these metal straps have been on there it's like almost 180 years. So again, these are really interesting things, and maybe insightful, helpful to you in your efforts. I mentioned the how journals can be important. This is a family tomb, in my church cemetery here in North Carolina, and no one really knew, other than the inset marble panel there that said Hope Family Tomb, had ever read anything about this thing at all. And I don't know why this isn't highlighted, but this is an excerpt from 1852 from a local judge, where he actually writes about someone who died and she was not buried but put into the vault of the Hope family and is to be taken north in a few years. So again, this stuff is out there. It just takes a little while to find it. Something else that's important for as part of your cemetery preservation planning efforts, you may be involved in a cemetery where they don't have many trees at all, but you may be a person who's involved in a cemetery who has a lot of trees. And trees can be pretty problematic because their root systems can dislodge and cause problems to the grave markers and monuments, but they also are a great natural enhancement to your cemetery. This is so I recommend to most groups who are in this situation that have a lot of trees in their cemeteries, is you need to have a tree survey and assessment of your trees, so you can understand not only what's there, but what are the conditions? Are there trees that need to be taken down? Are there trees that need to be trimmed? This is a great example. This is Greenwood Cemetery in Jackson, Mississippi, and their Friends organization that has been around for many, many years. In their records, they've been able to find notations in their minutes when some of these trees were planted, say 100, 125 years ago. So it's really, really interesting stuff. So we were working there doing a large conservation work project in 2024, and they did have they had a number of storms, but and I showed these photographs just to show, even after they were fortunate enough to get funding from the state to do some infrastructure improvements. But even after trimming the trees that needed to be trimmed, there were at least this red cedar here fell and knocked this this obelisk off here. So anyway, even in your best efforts, there's still a chance. But talking to the stewards there, they said if they had not trimmed those trees, it would have been much worse throughout the cemetery. Another part of that documentation And again, this may not be you may not have an example just like this. This is a fascinating church cemetery in Tarboro, North Carolina, in Edgecombe County. It's Calvary Episcopal Church and Cemetery. And Dr. John Cheshire, a clergyman and botanist, he actually planned before this church was built in the 1860s, and as part of that process, he planned and he wrote to people and planned and planted exotic and native trees and shrubs throughout the cemetery. And it's just a fascinating place. And all the trees are marked with the type of tree it is. So again, I encourage you as if you are if you have a cemetery like this, that you spend the time and work towards preserving it as well. Grave marker surveys. This is kind of straightforward, but it's interesting to me that in so many cases, folks that I have contact with don't look for these markings on grave markers, and they actually can add so much more to your research efforts and your archives of what you know about your cemetery. This is a collection of brownstone tablets in First Presbyterian Church Cemetery in Elizabeth, New Jersey, where we did some work. And the photograph on the right says cut by D. Jeffries. Another one that I recently I did a workshop is this great brownstone tablet. This is in Metuchen, New Jersey. And I know you can't respond to this, but after I saw this, I was pointed out that the stonecutter's name was placed prominently on this one. When I say, do you notice anything about the surface of this grave marker? It may be difficult to tell from the photograph, but as part of some project in the past, they actually put a sealant over these brownstone tablets. So I wonder why they had sort of a sheen to them. But anyway, just notice that this is a little side note. Backdating. I pointed this out. This is a grave marker that I'm actually in the process of conserving this and restoring this cemetery. And when I pointed out to one of the members of the organization who's funding the project, this headstone, which is dated 1840 and is actually marked F.A. McNish, Charlotte, North Carolina. I pointed out, so this is in the Appendix A of Ruth Little's book, Sticks and Stones, that she documented F.M. McNish he didn't operate a marble yard in Charlotte, North Carolina until the late 1860s into the 1870s. So we don't know if Eli Hoyle had a grave marker before this and this replaced it, or if he never had one and it was replaced, say, 25, 30 years later. So these are just little things to keep in mind as part of your research. Hardscape features. This is one of the best enclosures I've ever seen. This is a granite. These are granite blocks as part of this family enclosure for a cemetery. It's called the Seth Jones Cemetery. And not only is the enclosure unbelievable in itself, it's actually engraved or inscribed Seth Jones Family Burying Ground, AD 1844. Also, as part of your documentation, I mentioned geophysical surveys. Our company does quite a bit of ground penetrating radar surveys as well as LiDAR surveys. And what we encourage you to do, if this is something you're thinking about doing, is make sure you're in contact with a company that does geophysical surveys and have a conversation with them about what they think you should do, because we have folks come to us and say they think they need a ground penetrating radar survey when what could help them more is a LiDAR survey. And as you can see in this LiDAR survey, the number of really deep grave depressions for which there are no grave markers. So this was invaluable to the Friends of Gear Cemetery that we did this project. This is just another slide showing the various expansions of the cemetery overlaid onto the geophysical survey. This is another one where we were fortunate enough to do GPR and LiDAR. This is at the Mount Olive Cemetery at Jackson State University in Jackson, Mississippi. Another way to, as part of your documentation, if you can use an Excel spreadsheet, which a lot of people do, or you can use database forms. For a lot of projects, we use FileMaker Pro. It's a database. Using a database helps searching for things a lot easier, and also you can add photographs and things like that. Mapping. There are a lot of devices that you can use depending on how accurate you want it to be. This is a project that we did where we were mapping the damaged grave markers, and they needed to be quite accurate. So we used a device called a Trimble to get the GPS coordinates. Photography, this is something, excuse the pun, but I harp on a lot, and I won't do this again. The presentation will be available afterwards, but there's no excuse, in my opinion, nowadays for you not to be able to take really good photographs of grave markers. If this is something that you're really interested in, it may just be for your cemetery, or if you're someone who's out taking photographs on a regular basis. If you don't have a high quality SLR or DSLR camera, check the settings on your smartphone to make sure that your settings are set such that when you're taking photographs, you're at least taking photographs that are, say, between 2 and 3 megabytes each. It's really upsetting when folks share with me photographs and they're so blurry that I can't even use them. Some tips for taking photographs. If you are very serious about this, there's a way to reflect light, which I'm going to show you a photograph of how to do that. You can carry a water sprayer with you with a soft bristle brush, something that you would use to clean your dishes with. If you cannot read the grave marker, that's a way to do that. And when you take your photographs, there are a lot of different photo management systems that you can use. I take a lot of photographs with my phone, so I have a flash drive that I can plug into my phone that also plugs into my computer. So that's another thing to do. Also, when you're taking photographs, just pay attention to the environment. Don't take photographs where people are walking, behind it, or if people don't need to be in the photograph if you're focusing specifically on the cemetery or the grave marker. And if you can, just plan sessions where it's just you, or say you and a friend or a partner out in the cemetery. And I'm going to show you some slides of what I mean. So these are some photographs that have been shared with me, as well as ones that I found on Find a Grave, which is another topic. And if you're someone who adds photographs to Find a Grave, that's fantastic. But Find a Grave is not, genealogists are not the only individuals who use Find a Grave. There are a lot of folks who are interested in the grave markers. So if, the photograph here in the middle is actually from Find a Grave, where I know they were capturing this information for genealogical purposes and did not even take a photograph of the overall grave marker. So if you're sending them to someone a conservator to try to find out what it would cost to conserve or things like that, just try to take better shots to send and share with them. These are things that I suggest that you do, not because I took them, but just they're kind of obvious and common sense, but take the photograph straight on. If you can, visit the cemetery during the time where the sun is going to hit the face of the grave marker. Or I don't remember this gentleman's name, but he I think he attends the Association for Gravestone Studies conference every year. I think he lives in New Jersey or Pennsylvania, but he brings with him almost a full-length mirror. And a mirror is a great way to get reflection onto a grave marker. And as you can see in the cemetery on the right, every cemetery that we visited, he brought the mirror with him. And I'm not saying you have to carry a full-length mirror, but if you want to get really good, well-lit photographs, it may be an option for you. Groundskeeping and maintenance. I do not have historic photographs of some cemeteries that I was hoping to include, but I think everybody has in mind that every cemetery should look like a putting green, when in fact, originally it never did. So when you're considering maintenance of your cemetery, just keep these things in mind, and always encourage not to try to inject, say, a modern aesthetic into something that originally may have looked completely different. I showed these two photographs. These are African American cemeteries where I visited in North Carolina. The one on the left has had a lot of small, growth from small trees, but does have some really good ground cover. The photograph on the right I show has some yucca plants that are kind of a typical planting in African American cemeteries. And as the group that I met with, they were talking about future cleanup efforts at the cemetery, and I told them, before before you take on these efforts, make sure you understand what's in the cemetery and whether it should stay or whether it should go. Some municipalities have some really good resources that you may be able to use in terms of their turf maintenance. This is the city of Raleigh, North Carolina's turf maintenance and wildlife catalog. What they've tried to do over the years is put time and energy into more areas of wildflowers to prevent having to mow so much in areas that may be susceptible for damage from lawnmowers. These are just some great photographs showing this is an African American cemetery with yuccas. Always laugh because this individual here is a good friend of mine, and just how he's looking across the cemetery. What he thinks is in really bad shape, but I actually think is not that bad. Also, if you are a steward who, if your maintenance staff or the people you pay to mow are not happy with the placement of the grave markers, please don't let them move the grave markers to make it easier for their lawnmowers or their big zero-turn mowers to get through. Weed eaters can be so tough on these grave markers. This is a soapstone grave marker that, as you can see, it's done quite a bit of damage, and it may not be much longer before this is completely destroyed. This is a cemetery that many of these places had grass originally, and I know grass is problematic because you have to mow it. But if you kill all the grass, you may end up with erosion issues. These are photographs just showing some that we've seen where they've not only killed every blade of grass, but also used heavy equipment to remove stumps. We don't deal with this much in the Southeast, but in the Mid-Atlantic, they have a lot of issues with groundhogs, problems that they're issues for a number of reasons. Number one, they're digging all these tunnels and dislodging all these grave markers. What I suggest you do if you have these kind of issues is reach out to your cooperative extension office and see what answers they may have. Another thing we deal with, or one thing that we deal with, is fire ants. So any kind of critters that may cause problems can be detrimental to you if you're planning tours or doing other activities in your cemetery. So as part of your planning process is looking at what those are and determining how to remedy them. There are a number of cemeteries that are working with different types of, or using different types of grass to limit the amount of mowing that they're having to do every year. This is a cemetery where they're using centipede grass to see if they can, it's a much lower lying grass to limit the amount of mowing that occurs in their cemetery. I just like these photographs of using these cradle graves and as part of their efforts to literally not mow all the time as they're planting within these cradle graves and bedstead graves. When you're mowing, or if you're having a crew that's mowing, it's important for them not to blow grass clippings all over the grave markers for a number of different reasons. One, because of the way it looks, and also it creates what's called a microbial community, which if you've got all these grass clippings through rain, humidity, it can create fungus, lichen growth. So it's good for a number of reasons to get rid of it. And it's also part of your plan. You may have a really great cemetery with a lot of stories, but you have no site signage to let people, unless they're just super interested in grave markers, then there's you're going to have some signage. So here's some examples that we've seen in the past. It's also a good example to have signs that state what your rules and regulations are. Another thing, as part of your planning, some groups don't know about what types of designations you can get for your cemeteries. There's local landmark designation. There's listing in the National Register of Historic Places. Being listed in the National Register does not guarantee your preservation, and also just because it may not be listed does not mean it's not worthy of preservation. So this may be an avenue that you may be interested in pursuing as well. Just a few steps that obviously you can reach out to your State Historic Preservation Office about. But number one, contact your State Historic Preservation Office first about what's involved with the National Register process. Again, another slide just kind of showing you those steps. The National Park Service has the Preservation Brief 41 that talks about the National Register, or guidelines for applying to get your cemetery listed in the National Register of Historic Places. This is just some examples of a cemetery that our company did as part of a district, and some of the examples of the mapping that we've done. Also, as part of your planning, this may not be applicable to many folks at all, but accreditation as an arboretum. There are various steps in that process that you should explore if you you should check it out at least to see if it's something that your cemetery might qualify for. I can't say enough about community outreach, engagement, and recognition. We've built so many unbelievable partnerships. We've helped so many groups out over the years, whether it be for a workshop, a phone conversation, an email, and it's just building social capital, encouraging people, and people just being excited about what they're doing. Award programs, say if you in the county that you live in may have a historical organization who has some preservation awards. The photograph on the right is we've actually nominated some clients for awards, and they love those things. They're super excited about them, and they love having them on their wall. This is a recent ceremony that we attended in Mount Olive Cemetery, and that I mentioned before, where we did work in Jackson State University. This was actually a reinterment ceremony. One of the mausoleums, the decedents, human remains had been exposed, so our company handled that process, and we're fortunate enough to attend that ceremony actually a month ago. And the neat thing that came out of that is this couple here. The wife is actually the third great granddaughter of the woman for whom we had the reinterment ceremony. Thinking about those things as part of your planning efforts to document, research, involve the community, celebrate, and award. Just another example, in Greenwood Cemetery in Jackson, Mississippi, they have an unbelievable collection of roses of all different types that were planted at various points in the cemetery's history. While we were there working, a lady from a rose newsletter in California visited to write an article about all these roses in the cemetery. So again, recognize what your cemetery has that may draw people that you may not know about, but also recognizing that it may be something that you can use to push out to help people recognize what you have as well. Other things like newsletters. We did some work in Union County, New Jersey, and not only was the article in the Union County Historical Society's newsletters, but it was also in a Latino newspaper there. So that was really cool. So again, it's really just talking about how you can get the word out about what you're doing. Again, another newspaper article. When you have things going on in your cemetery, folks are looking, they're always looking for things to write about. So, make sure you get the word out about what you've got going on. And I had to share this because this came from my friend Sam just this morning. It's a ceremony they're having for the 688 CPD battalion, CPD, and I think it's in Pennsylvania. And so again, Sam's just really good about getting word out about number one, figuring out what they need to recognize, recognizing and promoting what they're doing and getting the word out. A lot of questions about fundraising and grant writing. That could literally be a whole session. I'm gonna give you some ideas that we typically use, and there are others. Reach out to me if you have other questions about things other than this. Try to find descendants of people buried in the cemetery. It may be difficult if you have a cemetery where there are 15,000 people buried, but if you have a small, more manageable size, if you can, try to find some of these descendants and get them involved. Create what we call a friends raising campaign. As one of my former board members used to say, you can't expect people to give if you don't have 100% participation for your board or your committee, which I think is something to keep in mind. We've seen folks who have had these started a Adopt a Grave campaign, contact local organizations and foundations. You may have a local community foundation, say a private foundation. You may have, say, your local DAR chapter that could help you get a DAR grant to do work in your cemeteries. We've worked on a number of projects that involve those. Contact companies like Home Depot, Lowe's, companies that are like these two, for not only potential cash contributions, but we've heard where, say, Home Depot would, as a community project, would take on certain things as part of a cleanup effort at a cemetery, or they would give gift cards so that these cemetery stewards could buy equipment as part of their community efforts. And not only these two businesses, but if you have a business within your community, go to them and ask them if they have any kind of giving program. I used to be a Rotarian, and I remember learning that there were some non-discretionary funds that our local club had. And I went to one of the board meetings, and they said that's why the funds were there. Also, there's just a number of businesses who are looking for programs like this. Give quarterly or annual cemetery tours focused on specific individuals. I've met people who they give a number of different types of tours. They give one that focuses on the funerary art. They give one that focuses on, say, more notable people, and then they give a tour that's focused on maybe more quirky people or more notorious people or infamous people buried in their cemeteries. I know the cemetery tours take a lot out of folks, so some folks are only able to do that once a year. We are seeing, or I'm reading a lot more about cemetery stewards who are kind of thinking outside of the box. And some folks like this and some folks don't. Some cemetery stewards are having concerts in their cemeteries. They're having poetry readings. They're having quilting groups there. So, these things are successful. And again, I think there are some people who are just not on board with it. Even things related to Halloween. Again, some folks they think it's disrespectful, and other folks are fine with it. Another option that we've heard, which may be beyond what you're able to do, but I think it's a potential if they could work it out. Recently, we learned about membership programs that afford people the opportunity to pay a membership fee to get access to to cemeteries to actually have their dogs walk off leash, which I thought it was a pretty good idea. Also, they're in a number of cemeteries in ways to address maintenance. They're using goats. So as part of that effort, they're having events that they call Goatchella. So again, these are just some ideas. Let me know if there are specific things that you've thought of that worked for you, because I'd love to hear. I told you I wasn't going to talk a ton about grave marker care, because we don't like to empower folks too much, because they may not have the skills and sets necessary. When you can do these things yourself is when you're cleaning. You can do a lot of cleaning. Your organization can do a lot of cleaning. I've heard about cemeteries where they've had local community groups who that's what they wanted to do. So they purchased the industry standard grave marker cleaner, and they use water and soft bristle brushes. But these are things you can do if you have consulted a conservator, and things that are relatively small. And so I'm just gonna, this is kind of the same thing, but never try to tackle things that are well beyond what your skill set is. Also, it's important as part of your planning process to go throughout your cemetery to identify potential safety issues and structural risk throughout the cemetery. And when you have these types of issues, it's better to contact a professional to try to help stabilize and slow down deterioration. Best practices with cleaning is basically, in a nutshell, using water, soft bristle brush. There is an industry standard cleaner. There is a National Park Service brief that I'm sure your SHPO can provide that addresses caring for your cemetery and your grave markers. These are just some examples. This is a group of stewards that I worked with about 15 years ago. They just wanted to do some basic things, and that's what we did. We didn't tackle anything large, and they were able to actually make a big difference in their cemetery. Again, just some examples here, before and after, of some things that you can do that don't require, an actual conservator there. Don't do these things. I strongly discourage you from doing these. I know the folks who did these probably had great intentions, but they ended up doing more harm. And a lot of this has to do with the usage of concrete. The photograph on the left shows it's a soapstone grave marker that was in pieces that they pretty much encased in concrete, and the one on the right has cinder blocks. This is just some of these are a little extreme, but I did find a cemetery in the middle of a field where they had farming equipment. It's not a great idea. Be careful what you plant in the cemetery, because it can actually grow beyond anything that you imagined and end up just basically taking over. I think this speaks for itself. This may be one of the most egregious ones I've ever seen. Pressure washing, we hear this a lot. Please don't pressure wash the grave markers. Yes, it does get them white, but what it ends up doing is it ends up pulling, basically, if you can think about stripping layers off of the grave marker, and to make you aware also that it is going to grow back. Concrete can be so detrimental. This stone snapped at the point where it was actually where the concrete was holding it underground. This is a graveyard. This is a cemetery where they've put concrete pads around every grave marker. I just use this slide to show that grave markers are like soft, low fire bricks on a building. If you are not using lime mortar and you're using, say, Portland cement, they do not work in accord with each other, and you're going to have issues. Memorialization, considerations for that. We always encourage that when you're considering a memorial, think about the overall uniformity of your cemetery as part of your planning efforts. If you have early on these things in place and you've been thinking about them, you can sort of prevent these types of things from happening when someone comes in and says, hey, we need to put this type of memorial here. Now, you can do whatever you want. I'm just saying that these are the types of recommendations that we make, just things to think about. This is actually at my home church. I don't know when this was done, but when they set these early 19th century grave markers in this granite, I don't know what they used that's created this material. I guess I should find out, but just keep these things in mind as part of your planning. This is at a Revolutionary War battle site where I actually think it was a good idea. The grave marker, they took the exact size of the grave marker and inscribed it on this new piece of granite. Expect the unexpected. We always say, or almost always say, when you don't know what's happening until you start digging in the ground. Now, obviously, for this photograph, this is a group of professional archaeologists who are working with me on this project. And what we encountered, we did not anticipate. So what we anticipated, we had to address in a different way. And one of the reasons why we do not encourage folks to take these kind of steps who don't know who've never done this before, is problem solving. You could be working on something and you end up finding something else that's close by. You may have some stones that you thought may be relatively, they're not that tall, but then when you try to reset them, you find out that they're actually quite a bit taller than they were. Again, you don't really know in a lot of cases what's going on until you start tackling them. This is what I thought was just a ground supported tablet, which actually turned into what we call a tab and socket that had a base. And so it took quite a while to get to this, where we thought it would be quite an easy job. Past repairs, I'm going to show some slides. What this slide here, if you are someone who is doing this, be careful, because if there are previous repairs, you don't know what they did. And we found out that they actually pinned some pretty large things with pins that were about a foot long. This is another one. It's kind of comical. Expect the unexpected. I call them the infamous ones. This is a table tomb in my town for a French gentleman named Lorenzo Ferrer that nobody really thought much about until two local authors published a book called Jean Lafitte, claiming that Lorenzo Ferrer is in fact Jean Lafitte. And since that time, they've had to put up cameras in their cemetery because of the amount of visitation, people leaving things on the grave. So this may be something that happens in your cemetery. Just be prepared if these types of things happen. This is another one that I learned about recently. This is in Alexandria, Virginia. This is the grave of the female stranger. There have been postcards about this grave marker. And the day that we arrived, there was a member of the church that was there removing things from the marble ledger stone. These are just some common issues that we see: cemetery, cement, epoxies, pinning, consolidation. There was no documentation of what was done before. These are just examples of some things that were done that we had to remove and things that were underneath. The unexpected was that there are actually bases underneath them. And this involved us rebuilding these things, trying to salvage as much of the brick as possible. I may not leave it up here long enough for you to see, but we didn't expect that they wouldn't be able to spell patriot. Sorry. When to call the professionals when there's extensive damage. If you have a lot of tablets that have fallen over and broken into 12, 15 pieces, it's something you probably shouldn't consider tackling. This is another example. When there's specialized material involved, if you have, say, big chunks missing, this gray marker was previously repaired. Whatever the repair material was not visible. We do not take it, we try to break it apart. So what we did was just repaired the missing part. Also specialized material. This is a specialized proprietary marble repair mortar. Large stuff, definitely do not try to undertake things that are way too big and you do not have the necessary equipment to undertake. Also complicated things. So if you have a collection of pieces in your cemetery, be careful what you're doing and possibly consider not tackling it if it may be too complicated for you to even tackle. Another thing about grave marker care that some folks don't really like, but it is an alternative, is replacements. This stone here was in such bad shape. The family had a photograph from the 1920s of what it originally looked like. So they paid a company a local monument company to make a replacement for it with the exact material on the front. And then on the back, they actually put the name of the monument company and the date. This is a recent example I saw in New Jersey, where they had this brownstone tablet that had a ton of delamination, but because of previous documentation, I think it was through their insurance paid for it, and they actually replaced it with a modern, it's actually granite, which is going to last a lot longer. This is a project that I did a number of years ago, a very important person who was related to the James K. Polk Historic Site in Pineville, North Carolina. They had all these pieces. They wanted to do something with them, so we conserved the marker and built a case for them to display in the visitor center. So again, it's just another potential alternative. These are grave markers that were found in a historic building on a county-owned historic site that was purchased, and they are trying to figure out what to do with them. And so they came up with a design to build a building just for them and actually put them on display instead of just leaving them in a storage facility somewhere. So this is an alternative that the architect came up with. And this is an alternative that one of our RGA's architects came up with in terms of how to display them. So it's just another alternative. So I'm gonna breeze through this case study because we're running out of time. Geer Cemetery is about a mile and a half northwest of downtown Durham, and the Piedmont of North Carolina. The cemetery is about 3 3/4 acres. It's thought that there were close to 2,000 people buried in the cemetery, and as I said, there were just under 300 grave markers. They think the cemetery started about 1877 when the Geer family, African Americans who were working on on the property, a child died, and they allowed them to be buried at the cemetery, and there were 2 expansions over time. I won't go through all of these, but Geer was surveyed by the WPA in 1937. The interments were stopped in 1939. The last burial was 1945. It was listed in the National Register of Places in 2024. They had a partnership with Duke University, which is another thing. If part of your planning, if you're in an area where there is a college, community college, that you could get involved with your effort, as part of your planning, it's a good idea. This is what the cemetery looked like in 1989 as a previous iteration of the Friends of Geer. This is just a grave marker survey. I've shown you these photographs from the LiDAR survey. Geer was fortunate enough to have a very well-known historian named Jill Lepore write an article about it for the New Yorker magazine, and it reached, as you can imagine, a lot of people. Also, there's a fantastic book by Dr. Adam Rosenblatt, who's a professor at Duke University, where that includes a case study of Geer Cemetery along with 2 other African American cemeteries, one in Richmond, Virginia, and one in Philadelphia. This is just their presentation of the letter about being listed in the National Register of Historic Places, and they have a few current projects, so they never stop. Trust me, they never stop. So they have a carriage path that runs throughout the cemetery. So they were able to get some grant funds because they were having erosion issues in the cemetery. So this is the plan, and this is what they've been able to do. Those areas that were eroding, they've been able to use hardscape features to try to prevent those issues, as well as some I say trim, some landscaping around the main sign. And here's also a photograph of that recently laid the material recently laid on the carriage path at Gear Cemetery. Again, we were fortunate enough to do some conservation work. Additional resources, these will be available. These aren't all of them, but they're Association for Gravestone Studies, that Preservation Brief 48 that I mentioned to you, which is fantastic. There are a number of states that have really good preservation manuals. Michigan, Illinois, South Carolina, a number of states have these really what I would consider really good preservation manuals that actually cover planning as well. They cover a lot of different areas. So at the end of the day, I always encourage people to do no harm and have fun. That's ultimately what we're here to do, and to protect the cemeteries. If you have any questions, again, beyond today, here's my contact information. Please reach out to me. Don't be afraid. Please do. I would love to hear from you.
All right. Well, great. Thank you so much for the information you've shared today. It'll be really useful to everyone. So we have a few questions. We have a little extra time that we can spend on these questions. So do you have any suggestions for how to reach out to and communicate with underrepresented communities when you're working on a cemetery plan?
Yeah, so I'm sorry, I was just scrolling through the questions as well. So I guess the question back would be, so their question is, are they writing a plan, or are they considering? I don't know if they say that.
It just says, do you have suggestions for how to reach out to and communicate with underrepresented communities?
Okay, so what we do on the preservation plans that we write, and I'll give you an example. I'll give you a few examples. One in particular is an African American cemetery that's part of a state park in the western part of North Carolina. So it's fortunate that it's in a state park, because there's some protection there as being part of a state park. Well, there's an organization called the Foothills Conservancy of North Carolina that helped acquire more land for the state park. So they're the ones who reached out to us about doing some geophysical survey work, as well as writing a preservation plan. So what we did, first of all, is we said, what kind of contact do you have with the descendant community? Luckily they did. And so what we did, the very first step in the process was having a kickoff meeting with members of the descendant community to find out what they wanted, because we can write a preservation plan for you all day. I mean, that's, I'd say you just follow, there are a lot of manuals that tell you how to do them, but we wanted this to be tailored specifically to their wants and needs. And so for that project, we not only did that in the beginning, we had bench kind of milestone meetings with them, in addition to, once we send them, and I know this is not exactly actually a question, but I'm coming back to it. Then we had a follow-up meeting at the end after they saw the plan. And then beyond that, we're having a public meeting that involves the descendant community. So what we've learned over the years with these projects that involve underrepresented communities, most of ours, I will say, already has at least a person or two who is involved from that community. If you don't, if it's not a church cemetery, I would suggest reaching out to local churches, unless you know someone within, let's say, the African American community that's sort of an activist, if you will, or they're very active within their community. But my experience has always been, whether it's cemetery preservation planning, if it's oral history, anything within the public history realm, is I've worked with a lot of African American ministers to find people within that community or those communities who know something about, or can tell you who to get in contact. I hope that's helpful.
All right. So the next question: is there any legal protection for family cemeteries when the land has changed hands? And does the family have any rights for ingress and egress and maintenance?
So that's a question. I don't know where if they're in Oklahoma or not. I'll tell you, I don't know law like the cemetery laws in every state. I will tell you in North Carolina, if you're trying to get access, what we always encourage, even before you go to the statutes, is and you may have done this, but I've seen some examples that are not that easy. So try to be diplomatic first, and you may have already done this. Reach out to the property owner, tell them what you're doing, and if the property owner is just obstinate and they say no, you can't. In North Carolina, you can go to your local clerk of court, and I'm pretty sure this. I want to make sure this is what I remember. You could go to the clerk of court and basically get a document that outlines that you are a descendant or you are a family member that can get you access. And then ultimately, you don't want to take this step. I was told about a specific cemetery where the owners would not allow access. And I don't think any descendants tried to take that route or knew they could take that route. And it was explained to me that maybe through a planning department, and Lynda, as a planner, you may chime into this too. Our planning department said they could get an administrative search warrant if there was any concern that the grave markers had been demolished. So I know that's not an exact answer for you, but I would just suggest looking at what the law is in your state. And beyond that, like I said, reach out to me. I know some attorneys who can be helpful with this.
I just put the state statute here in
Okay, gotcha.
the question and answer tab, so people can go ahead and read that there.
Great.
Okay, so I think we have time for about one more question.
Sure.
Oklahoma resources that might support research, recognition, and documentation? Question mark. So I guess the question is, what kind of resources should they be looking to? But I think you'll be talking about that a little more in session 2, correct?
Yeah. So as I mentioned early on, I didn't want to jam into one presentation what's going to be, in the next 2. So I hope everybody will come back out for the next 2.
All right.